Welcome to Beyond the Rings, the channel where we take Tolkien's silences exactly as seriously as we take his sentences. Tonight we are doing something a little different. We are not analyzing a scene, we are analyzing the absence of one. There is no chapter, no line, no footnote anywhere across 50 years of drafts, letters, and posthumous editorial archaeology where Tom Bombadil and Sauron the Necromancer occupy the same page. And yet the shape of that missing scene, once you go looking for it properly across the letters, the appendices, and the 12 unruly volumes of the history of Middle-earth, turns out to be one of the most theologically loaded blank spaces the old man ever left us. So pull up a stool. Tonight we are reconstructing why that meeting never happened, and arguing that the reasons it never happened are considerably more unsettling than if it had. Start with the geography, because geography in this legendarium is never just geography. Every bounded region of power in Arda that actually holds is bounded by a will strong enough to impose itself on the fabric of that specific patch of land, not by walls or armies. Melian's girdle around Duriath is the textbook case, and it is worth remembering how it actually failed. It did not fall to a siege. It fell the moment Melian's own grief unraveled her presence after Thingol's death, because the barrier was never a spell in the fairy tale sense. It was Amaya's sustained attention made structural. The Old Forest and the Barrow Downs function on the same logic. Bombadil's dominion there is not a magical field he switches on. It is the exact shape of his will, continuously present over a bounded piece of Arda. Which means if Sauron's power in the Second or Third Age had ever actually tested that boundary, the way Morgoth's remnant forces eventually tested Doriath's, the text gives us every structural reason to expect the same kind of failure for the same reason. Not because Bombadil would win a fight, because there would be nothing there shaped like a fight to have. This is where the fandom conversation usually goes wrong, and I will die on this hill. Every time this hypothetical comes up online, someone frames it as a power-scaling exercise, as if we are trying to figure out whether Bombadil could tank a Nazgul's Morgul blade, or shrug off the ring's temptation the way Aragorn shrugs off a flesh wound. That is the wrong axis entirely, and it is the wrong axis because it misunderstands what Sauron's entire operational doctrine actually is. Every one of Sauron's real victories in the text is won by converting a contest of wills into a contest of leverage. Númenor falls not to armies, but to Ar-Pharazôn's fear of death, weaponized patiently over years. Celebrimbor falls to pride in his own craft. Saruman falls to the seduction of being consulted as an equal. Even the 9 mortal kings who became the Nazgul fell to entirely mundane vices, dressed up as gifts. Sauron's toolkit is, without exception, a toolkit for exploiting desire, and Bombadil is the single documented figure in the entire legendarium immune to that toolkit at the root. Not because he resists desire the way a disciplined ascetic resists temptation, but because dominion, possession, and power over others simply never register on his instrument panel as things worth wanting in the first place. Tolkien said as much directly, describing Bombadil in letter 144 as representing a kind of pure, disinterested love of knowledge for its own sake, with no impulse whatsoever toward possessing or dominating what he loves. That is not a strong will resisting a strong offer. That is a being for whom the offer itself doesn't pass, and a necromancer whose entire method is offering the right lever to the right desire has, against that specific target, no lever at all. Which brings us to the title itself, and here is a hot take I will happily defend against anyone who wants to fight about it in the comments. The Necromancer is not a boast, it is closer to a confession of category. Necromancy in Tolkien's actual usage, not the Dungeons and Dragons usage everyone imports into it, is dominion exercised specifically over death, over the dead, and over the fear of dying. It is, structurally, a mortal anxiety weaponized. Every ounce of Sauron's leverage over men in particular runs through that fear, culminating in the entire Númenorian catastrophe. Bombadil, by his own account to Frodo in the house on the edge of the old forest, predates the fear of death being a live concept at all. He tells the hobbits, in that famously self-referential little speech, that he was here before the river and the trees, that he is eldest. A being whose power base is entirely built on mortal terror of the end has, against a being who was already ancient before mortality's terms had even been written, exactly zero purchase, which reframes the title Dol Guldur, eventually earns not as menace pointed outward at everyone equally, but as an accidental admission of the one category of opponent that particular menace was never built to touch. Before we leave the Necromancer title behind, it's worth dragging in a piece of history most readers file under a completely different chapter, because I think it belongs here. The Barrow Downs, sitting right on Bombadil's doorstep, are haunted specifically because of Angmar. Appendix A lays out how the Witch King, who would go on to become the terrifying Wraith Lord we meet in the Third Age, ruled the northern kingdoms of Arnor and Cardolan during their long, slow collapse, and how spirits of malice were sent out from Angmar to occupy the old burial mounds of the Dunedain once those kingdoms had fallen. That means the Barrow-White Frodo and company encounter in Fog on the Barrow Downs is not generic undead flavor. It is a direct, documented export of Sauron's own chief servant's necromantic work, planted in the ground a stone's throw from Bombadil's front door, centuries before the necromancer even reveals himself openly at Dol Guldur. So this is not a hypothetical proximity we're inventing for the video. Sauron's necromancy, quite literally, had already reached the edge of Bombadil's territory once before, through the Witch King, and the result on record is that Bombadil walks in, sings the white back into its grave with a rhyme, and hands the hobbits daggers out of the Barrow's own hoard like it's Tuesday. If that is the historical baseline for how Bombadil handles necromantic incursion at his border, it is not exactly a promising track record for the necromancer proper to build a second attempt on. Now let's talk about Gandalf, because I think the Council of Elrond scene gets skimmed past by 90% of readers who are impatient to get to the part where Boromir starts arguing. Go back and actually read what Gandalf says when Bombadil comes up as a potential ring-bearer. He does not dismiss Tom as weak. He explicitly says Bombadil has no wish for such things. And then, and this is the part everyone glosses over, he adds an oddly specific prophecy, that if all else in Middle-earth fell, Bombadil would fall too, last as he was first. That is a strangely precise piece of forecasting for a wizard who elsewhere claims to know almost nothing certain about what Bombadil actually is. Precision like that does not come from guessing. It comes from having already run the thought experiment. And if the White Council, of which Gandalf was a founding and increasingly frustrated member, had already quietly modeled a Sauron versus Bombadil confrontation and filed the answer away without ever voicing it aloud, that would explain something else that has always bugged me about the Third Age timeline. Why the White Council spent literal centuries deliberately not attacking Dol Guldur, even after Gandalf confirmed the necromancer's identity, citing fear of provoking Sauron into revealing himself too early. Unfinished Tales, in the Hunt for the Ring material, lays out just how calculated and reluctant that delay actually was. A council that cautious about provoking Sauron over a stronghold is not a council that would leave an entire, unexamined variable sitting one forest away from that stronghold. They knew something about the old forest. They just weren't telling the hobbits, and frankly, they weren't telling us either. There's an even more direct piece of evidence sitting in plain sight, and it comes from Sauron's own agents rather than from speculation about the White Council's private deliberations. Unfinished Tales, in the essay on the Hunt for the Ring, reconstructs the Nazgul's movements in painstaking detail during the weeks they search for the Shire and for Frodo. And that search brings the Black Riders directly through Bree and into the immediate vicinity of Buckland and the Old Forest's eastern border while trailing the hobbits. These are not junior scouts. This is the Witch King of Angmar himself, leading 8 of the 9, operating at the absolute peak of Sauron's available intelligence apparatus, within a day's ride of Bombadil's realm, actively hunting the single most important object in the Third Age. And what do they do at the forest's edge? Nothing. They search Bree, they search Buckland, they ride the road. There is no account anywhere of the Nazgul entering the Old Forest itself, despite the Hobbit's route theoretically making that the fastest and most obvious pursuit path, and despite Frodo, Sam, Merry and Pippin spending an entire vulnerable night practically inside Bombadil's house, while the riders are actively converging on the region. Either this is a staggering coincidence of narrative convenience, which I refuse to accept from an author this deliberate, or the Witch King's own instructions, presumably passed down from Dol Guldur itself, carried an unstated but very real order to avoid that particular stretch of woodland. Sauron's most trusted agent, actively hunting the ring at maximum urgency, chose to go around Bombadil's front yard rather than through it. That is not nothing, that is operational doctrine. Here's a piece of corroborating evidence almost nobody brings up, and it's hiding in a song. Treebeard's list chant in the Two Towers, the one where he catalogues the oldest living things of Middle-earth from memory, places Bombadil in that same ancient company. And Ents, famously, are the other great non-interventionist power in the entire War of the Ring. They sit out the whole conflict, cultivating their forest, until Saruman's industrial vandalism physically reaches their doorstep and forces the issue. That is precisely the posture Bombadil holds for the entire war as well. He does not report to Rivendell. He does not send scouts to Gondor. He simply persists, undisturbed, in his bounded patch of Arda, exactly like Fangorn persists in its own. So if Sauron's agents, at any point across 3,000 years of occupying Dol Guldur, had ever probed the edges of the Old Forest, the way Saruman's agents eventually probed the edges of Fangorn, the total absence of any surviving record of that probe is not evidence that nothing happened. It is exactly the kind of non-event that would leave no record, because neither Ents nor Bombadil report back to anyone, ever, about anything. Silence, in this specific case, is not absence of evidence. It's consistent with the evidence we would expect either way, which is a much more annoying and much more interesting position to be in as a researcher. And this is where I want to drag Christopher Tolkien into the conversation, because the History of Middle-earth volumes are full of his father circling Bombadil's actual nature, and then deliberately refusing to land the plane. He is not filed as a Valar. He is not filed as a Maiar in the way Gandalf or Sauron himself are Maiar. He is not an elf, not a spirit of a specific natural feature, the way Ossa or Unin are bound to the sea. Letter 153 is the clearest statement of intent we have, where Tolkien insists Bombadil is meant to remain, in his own words, an enigma, and actively resists every reader's attempt to pin him into the cosmological hierarchy. That refusal to categorize is not an oversight, it's load-bearing, and it matters enormously for our hypothetical, because it means any theory of a meeting between these two cannot be dismissed on the grounds that Sauron would simply recognize what kind of being he was dealing with and calibrate accordingly. Sauron's entire strategic intelligence apparatus, the Palantiri, the Nazgul, the spies threaded through every court in Middle-earth, is built to classify threats by type. Bombadil's is, within the text's own internal logic, deliberately unclassifiable, by design, by the author's own stated intent. You cannot outmaneuver a category error. You can only be confused by it, possibly forever. Let's get precise about when this hypothetical encounter would even have to occur, because the Tale of Years in Appendix B actually gives us a suspiciously convenient window. Sauron establishes himself secretly in Dol Guldur around the year 1000 of the Third Age, operating under the Necromancer identity for centuries before Gandalf's first reconnaissance in 2063 confirms his presence. What follows is the stretch of history literally named the Watchful Peace, running from that visit until 2460, when Sauron feels secure enough to return and openly declare himself. 400 years of Sauron going quiet immediately after being identified is, on its face, a strange decision for a being who does not generally respond to exposure by retreating, unless something during that exact window convinced him that expansion in that particular direction was a bad bet. If a reconnaissance mission, or even an unintended proximity toward the Old Forest, occurred sometime in that gap, it would explain two things at once: why Sauron never again directly tested that specific region for the remainder of the age, and why the word watchful in the piece's name might be doing more work than we usually give it credit for. Not resting, watching, specifically watching the one direction his usual doctrine couldn't model. Let's push the metaphysics one level deeper, because this is a Beyond the Rings episode, and I refuse to let us coast on vibes when Morgoth's ring is sitting right there. Home Volume 10 develops, at real length, the concept of the marring of Arda, the idea that Melkor's corruption was woven into the actual substance of the world during the music itself, meaning no part of physical Middle-earth is theoretically free of that taint, structurally, permanently, down to the level of matter. That is a genuinely bleak piece of theology, and Tolkien does not walk it back, except, arguably, in the one place the text keeps stubbornly gesturing toward, without ever confirming outright, wherever Bombadil's will actually holds. The Barrow-Wight's malice, itself a leftover of ancient evil from the wars against Angmar, cannot cross into Bombadil's bounded land uninvited, and flees the moment he speaks. Meanwhile, Dol Guldur is the literal textbook case of the marring spreading outward through a living landscape, corrupting Greenwood the Great slowly enough that its own name changes underneath it, becoming Mirkwood in the mouths of the people who used to love it. Here's the detail that turns this from a thematic echo into something closer to literal kinship. Tolkien's notes on the ancient forests of Eriador and Rhovanion, gathered across the Appendices and unfinished tales, describe the Old Forest, Fangorn, and the vast woodland that eventually splits into Greenwood the Great, and later Mirkwood, as surviving fragments of one primeval forest that once stretched almost unbroken across the whole of northwestern Middle-earth, before the Second Age's wars and the rising works of men and dwarves cut it into isolated pockets. Bombadil's forest and Sauron's corrupted forest are not just thematically opposed. At some root level of Arda's own botanical history, they are the same organism, severed by time and by roads and by the slow creep of civilization into two remnants under two radically different stewardships. One kept whatever it had at the beginning. The other got occupied by a Maya who spent 3,000 years quietly poisoning it from the inside until the trees themselves turned hostile to travelers. That is not a metaphor I'm bolting on for a punchy transition. That is the geography Tolkien actually wrote, and it means every time we talk about Bombadil's realm and Dol Guldur, as if they're simply two dots on a map, we're understating how close this comparison actually sits. It's less two kingdoms and more one body, with one half still breathing clean and the other half rotting from a wound 3,000 years old. Which raises a question I don't think this hypothetical ever quite asks out loud. If the Old Forest and Mirkwood share root and rhizome going back to before either name existed, did whatever kept Bombadil's end clean actually stop cold at some border, or did it simply hold ground the way any living system holds ground against infection? Over centuries, the text never bothers to narrate because nothing about it produced a battle worth an appendix entry. Tree by tree is not the kind of war anyone writes history down for. It's entirely possible the real story here isn't a single dramatic meeting at all. It's a multi-thousand-year siege fought at the level of root systems and soil, with Bombadil's end of the forest simply never losing an inch, and Sauron, for all his patience, never quite understanding what exactly he'd failed to take. Put those two geographies in the same frame, and the Bombadil hypothetical stops being a power-scaling argument and becomes a direct staging of the marring's central open question. Is there any place in Arda that actually resists corruption at the root? Or is Bombadil's apparent immunity itself evidence that Eru reserved at least one exception even Melkor's music could never fully touch? That is not a fan theory. That is the actual theological stakes of the text, and this ridiculous, delightful little hypothetical happens to sit right on top of them. I want to take a brief detour into adaptation, because you know I can't let an episode go by without at least one hot take on this front. Peter Jackson cut Bombadil from the Fellowship film entirely, and for pure narrative pacing in a 3-hour theatrical structure, fine, I understand the math, I've made peace with it. What I have not made peace with is how frequently that cut gets defended online with the argument that Bombadil is narratively irrelevant, a detour with no consequence for the plot. That argument only works if you think plot is the only currency the text is trading in. Rings of Power, whatever else you want to say about its handling of Second Age chronology, at least understood that Bombadil's value is atmospheric and philosophical rather than plot mechanical when they finally put him on screen in the second season. He functions as a pressure valve, a reminder that not every corner of Middle-earth is legible to power before the story plunges back into rooms where power is the only currency anyone is trading in. Whether or not you think the show earned that scene, and I have opinions, the instinct to treat Bombadil as a philosophical checkpoint rather than a combatant is the correct instinct, and it is precisely the instinct our entire hypothetical tonight has been built on. Where I think the show actually stumbles is in making Bombadil legible in service of the stranger's arc, giving him dialogue that edges toward exposition about who the wandering wizard is destined to become. Book Bombadil never explains anyone to anyone. He answers questions with riddles about berries and river daughters and lets you sit in your own confusion. The moment a version of Bombadil starts functioning as a plot device that confirms another character's identity, you have quietly smuggled him back into the very hierarchy of legible power he was invented to sit outside of, and that, more than any liberty with the timeline, is the adaptation choice I'd actually push back on at the pub. Let's zoom out for a second, because I think there's a bigger frame sitting underneath all 10 of tonight's premises that's worth naming directly before we land the plane. The Ainulindale tells us that Melkor's discord was woven into the music from the start, and that Eru's response was not to erase the discord, but to weave a third theme through it, deep and wide and beautiful, that took the rebellion's own material and turned it toward a fuller conclusion than either theme could have reached alone. Scholars of the text have argued for decades about how literally to take that as active providence within the actual events of the story, rather than as pure creation myth sitting outside the narrative's day-to-day causality. But if there is one candidate in the entire legendarium for a walking, talking fragment of that third theme, planted deliberately outside Melkor and Sauron's reach, existing before the quarrel even started, and persisting untouched by it, regardless of what happens to the rest of Arda. It is very hard to name a better candidate than the fellow who was there before the river and the trees. Which means the reason Sauron never gets his scene with Bombadil might not be tactical at all. It might be theological, in the most literal sense the word can carry in this legendarium. Some things in the music were never his to touch in the first place. So let's close the loop on why Sauron loses this encounter without a single blow being struck, because I don't want to leave this as a vague vibe. Every mechanism Sauron has ever used to open a negotiation, and negotiation is always where it starts, even with Ar-Pharazôn, even with Saruman, requires converting a contest of wills into a contest of power by first identifying what the other party wants, and then offering to be the one who provides it. The ring itself is the physical instantiation of that method, an object whose entire function is to amplify whatever desire for control already exists in the wearer's heart. And we have, in the text, the single cleanest null result in the entire legendarium. Bombadil puts on the ring in his own house, in front of Frodo, and nothing happens. Not resistance, not struggle, nothing, no effect, because the mechanism requires a desire for dominion to amplify, and there is none present to grab hold of. That is not Bombadil defeating the ring. That is the ring's entire operating principle failing to find purchase, the same way a key fails to turn in a lock it was never cut for. A meeting between Sauron and Bombadil, in this framing, is not a fight Bombadil wins. It's a fight that cannot structurally begin, and I would argue that outcome is considerably more unsettling for Sauron than losing one would be, because losing a fight tells you your opponent is strong. Failing to start one tells you your entire theory of power has a hole in it you cannot see the edges of. And that, finally, is why Tolkien himself could never have written this scene, and why I don't think the absence is an oversight so much as a structural necessity. Letter 53 has Tolkien describing Bombadil as something close to an exhibition of pure, real natural science, a character whose entire purpose in the text is to stand slightly outside the moral and metaphysical machinery everyone else is caught inside of, observing rather than participating. The moment you write an actual confrontation between Bombadil and Sauron, you are forced to resolve on the page exactly what kind of being Bombadil is relative to the Ainur, relative to Eru, relative to the whole hierarchy Tolkien spent decades in his letters deliberately declining to finish mapping. Write that scene and the ambiguity collapses. The enigma stops being an enigma and becomes a data point with stats attached. So the absence in the actual books is not a gap waiting to be filled by fan speculation, ironically including tonight's episode. It is the exact condition under which Bombadil is allowed to keep being what he is, which means every version of this encounter we can build, out of Melian's Girdle, out of the Watchful Peace, out of Treebeard's song and the marring of Arda and Gandalf's suspiciously precise prophecy at the Council, is not filling in a blank Tolkien forgot to write. It's tracing the exact outline of a blank he protected on purpose for 50 years, letter after letter, refusal after refusal, and honestly, that might be the most Tolkien thing about this whole hypothetical. The most important encounter in his entire legendarium might be the one he made absolutely certain never got written down. That's the pub talk case for tonight. Same shelf next week, same arguments, same refusal to let a footnote lie undisturbed. This has been Beyond the Rings.